Let's kick this off by talking about the VCLM or vSphere Lifecycle Manager architecture. How exactly does this work? Well, first, let's define what lifecycle management is at a higher level. This is the process of installing software or hardware and then maintaining it throughout its life, and then finally decommissioning it when the time comes. So let's take a server, a physical server in the data center as an example. You as an IT administrator would manage the lifecycle of that server. You would deploy it in the data center, you would install the software, you would utilize it, you would maintain it over its life, keeping the hardware and the software up to date. And then finally, when it's reached the end of its life, when it's old, you would decommission it and let's say recycle it. So that's the general idea here with lifecycle management. But how does that apply to VMware vSphere? Well, vSphere Lifecycle Manager, or VLCM, is what maintains the software running on your ESXi hosts and clusters, and it provides the entire lifecycle. So think of it as deploying a new cluster, installing ESXi, and then keeping that software up to date over time. And then finally, when the time comes, decommissioning that ESXi host. But the most important part of this, honestly, is the maintenance of the software over the life of that host or the life of that cluster. So vSphere Lifecycle Manager actually runs in vCenter. It's not something you have to install separately. It uses the embedded VCSA or vCenter Server Appliance PostgreSQL database. You don't have to install a separate database for this either. It utilizes the vCenter Server Appliance database, and its services run on vCenter as well. It's automatically enabled in the vSphere client. There's no plugin or add-on you have to install. VLCM or vSphere Lifecycle Manager is simply just there with VMware vSphere 7. And oh, by the way, it's going to replace vSphere Update Manager, or VUM. So vSphere Lifecycle Manager is the replacement for vSphere Update Manager. And honestly, vSphere Lifecycle Manager is a huge improvement over vSphere Update Manager. I'm so thankful that they provided this new tool to keep our vSphere infrastructure up to date. Now, vSphere Lifecycle Manager uses what they call the declarative model. So what is a declarative model? Well, the idea here is that you define what you want your hosts and clusters to run, specifically the version of ESXi, let's say in this case, not exactly how you want them to get there. What that means to you is that vSphere Lifecycle Manager is going to make your life far easier. You're not going to have to say exactly how you want your hosts to be updated and exactly how you want it to be done. Instead, you'll be able to simply say, I want this image to be used on all hosts across the cluster, keep them all up to date, and just handle the updates for me. And even more importantly, while you do the updates, ensure that all the virtual machines are always up and running. So let's talk about some highlights here of vSphere Lifecycle Manager. It maintains ESXi host versions, firmware, drivers, and even optional vendor add-ons. So it's not just the ESXi hypervisor by itself. It can actually do a lot more. It's important to know that this only works with vSphere 7.0 and higher. It's not going to maintain and update vSphere 6.x hosts or clusters. VCLM will automatically check for new software and let you know when it's available, and it far simplifies the deployment of OEM components as they're added to the image, replacing the vendor-specific ISOs. So if you have ever had, let's say, a Dell or an HPE server that has specific components in the server that required you to use, let's say, a Dell or HPE ISO of ESXi, that no longer has to be done. That's because VCLM can include the drivers and optional vendor add-ons in the ESXi image when it deploys it. The quick start workflow is a very nice feature to get new clusters up and running. And by using what vCLM calls images instead of what vSphere Update Manager called baselines, you'll be able to ensure that all hosts in a cluster are always using the same image. And we'll be talking more about the differences between baselines and images coming up next. When using vSphere Lifecycle Manager, it's important to understand the difference between baselines and images. Baselines really come from vSphere Update Manager, and while vSphere Lifecycle Manager still supports baselines, images are the new recommended option for keeping your hosts up to date. So let's first define what a cluster image is. It starts off with an ESXi version, which is a base version of ESXi. Of course, we're talking about here ESXi version 7.0 or later. And then on top of that ESXi specific image, you might have vendor add-ons, which are vendor firmware and drivers that are specific to the hardware that this ESXi software will be installed on. So if you have, let's say, a Dell ESXi host, vSphere Lifecycle Manager will recognize that and then most likely recommend some firmware and additional add-on software that Dell says that you need to install on that ESXi host. It could be drivers for a network interface card that came on that Dell server. Or it could be, let's say, the Dell Open Managed tools that Dell recommends you install on each ESXi host so that you can manage those with the Dell management software. Again, these are just some examples of vendor-specific add-ons. And then on top of that, you can also have custom firmware and drivers. For example, let's say that you installed a special network interface card in this ESXi host, and you want to supply your own custom driver or firmware that would also be applied as part of this image that you'll be deploying onto each of the ESXi hosts that make up this cluster. So once that cluster image is created, vSphere Lifecycle Manager will ensure that that image with these vendor add-ons and custom drivers that you specified is always being used in the cluster. And that's the idea behind this declarative model. If, for example, one of the hosts in that cluster reboots one day and a different image is being used that doesn't contain the vendor add-ons, for example, vSphere Lifecycle Manager will quickly remediate that host and ensure that the cluster image that you specified is being used. So if we compare the difference between baselines that came from vSphere Update Manager and images that are new in vSphere Lifecycle Manager, a baseline is really defined as a collection of different bulletins, as vSphere calls it. A baseline works by applying updates, and there's no guarantee that exactly what you specified will always be in place, unless you do a periodic remediation. A baseline offers limited software recommendations, and it's not portable outside of the vCenter host. There's no remote branch office support to use a baseline on, let's say, a remote office to keep that remote office's software up to date, and there's no RESTful API. Images, on the other hand, are what VMware defines as a collection of components that work by ensuring a specific image is always in use. There are recommendations for ESXi images, firmware, and drivers, as well as vendor-specific add-ons for all the hosts running in a cluster. And images are actually portable via exporting. So I can export an image and I can say, let's use this on another vCenter server. So I could create the definition of an image once and then use it many times. With images, you can create a local depot and then use that for updating remote offices. And then finally, there is a RESTful API available should you want to do some automation around updating, should you want to do some automation around lifecycle management. I should point out that while vSphere Update Manager uses baselines and images are recommended to be used with vSphere Lifecycle Manager, vSphere Lifecycle Manager still supports the use of baselines if you should choose to do that. So now let's talk a little bit about vSphere Lifecycle Manager depots. vSphere Lifecycle Manager uses something called a depot as the source repository, if you will, for all the software that you might be using to update your ESXi hosts. Here in the vSphere web client, you'll find Lifecycle Manager right here on the home menu. If you go into Lifecycle Manager, the first thing that you'll see is your image depot. The image depot is really broken down into 3 different sections. You have ESXi versions shown here, followed by vendor add-ons listed here. For example, add-ons from Dell and HPE, but notice that there are 3 pages of add-ons available. And then components, which might be, for example, a Broadcom SAS controller driver. And again, notice there are multiple pages of components. If you look in the top right-hand corner, you'll see the last synchronization time and when the next synchronization will occur. So 5 hours ago, our vCenter server here at the Wired Brain Coffee Company contacted the official VMware Online Depot as the download source for all of these different types of software updates, ESXi versions, vendor add-ons, and components. And 18 hours from now, our vCenter server will automatically check again to see if there are new ESXi versions, add-ons, and components from, again, that official VMware Online Depot. If you go to the Imported ISOs tab, it is possible, of course, to still import an ISO that you've downloaded from the internet, for example, from VMware.com. And you can also optionally perform cluster level overrides if you wanted specific clusters to use software other than what was provided by the official VMware Online Depot. As we talked about, baselines are the more traditional model of keeping your ESXi hosts up to date from vSphere Update Manager. We'll talk more in just a moment about using images, which are new in vSphere. But first, let me demonstrate exactly how you would go about using a baseline. Here in the vSphere web client, inside Lifecycle Manager, if you go to the Baselines tab, you'll see here that by default, there are 3 predefined baselines: non-critical host patches, critical host patches, and host security patches. vSphere was also nice enough to create us a recommended baseline based on our vSAN cluster. If you select one of these baselines, for example, critical host patches, you can see the list of critical patches that are inside that baseline. You could then apply this baseline to a host or host cluster and then do what they call remediation, which is essentially updating the host to install the necessary software. You can also, of course, create a new baseline or a baseline group. So what's the difference between a baseline and a baseline group? Well, as you might guess, a baseline group is really a group of baselines. So I can apply a baseline group to a cluster, and then I can scan that entire cluster against multiple baselines all at the same time, and then remediate or apply or update those hosts using software from multiple baselines, again, all at once. So if I were to create a new baseline, let's call this Wired Brain Coffee host baseline 1, and then inside a baseline, you can have 3 different types of content. You could have upgrades, patches, or what they call extensions. In our case, let's make this a upgrade baseline. And this is where we would manually select an ISO that we have updated, a specific version of ESXi. And this again points out the difference between baselines and images, because as you can see here in the image depot, we already have our ISOs that were discovered when our vCenter server synchronized with VMware.com. So if we're going to use a baseline, we have to first import an ISO. Now, this could be a file name or a URL. If I click Browse, right here on my desktop, I've actually already downloaded VMware 7.0 Update 1. I'll click Open. The ISO is uploaded to the server, and now this is available to us to create our baseline. Let's go back and now create our baseline again. We'll call this Wired Brain Coffee Company Upgrade Baseline 1. Again, it's an upgrade baseline. We'll click Next. We'll select our new version of ESXi, click Next, and Finish. And so we just created our first baseline. Now what you do with a baseline is to go to the host and cluster level. And for example, let's take an individual host, go to the Updates tab, and then this is where we would attach a baseline or baseline group. We'll select the Wired Brain Coffee Company Upgrade Baseline, and then check Compliance. This will take just a moment. And now you can see that there are 12 patches, including 7 critical and 9 security. Now, if we select an individual baseline, for example, just our ESXi version 7.0, we could choose to remediate just based on this. What this would do is to see if there are any issues with us performing a remediation, which in this case is not just applying some patches, but actually upgrading the version of ESXi. I'll go into the full remediation pre-check report. It tells us here that DRS should be enabled to ensure that virtual machines running on this host are properly migrated. It also warns us that vCenter Server is installed on a virtual machine running in the cluster, and there's a virtual CD drive connected. These are likely going to cause some issues with the upgrade that we need to take care of before we remediate. Again, the recommendation with vSphere Lifecycle Manager is to use images instead of baselines. But I wanted you to have a good overview and understanding of exactly how baselines work before we start using images. Now let's compare what we learned about using baselines to using images with vSphere Lifecycle Manager. We're here in Lifecycle Manager, and again, we have our image depot. We didn't have to download an ISO and import it into our vCenter server. That's because the image depot was automatically updated and synchronized with the official VMware online repository. To use these images, we'll go into Hosts and Clusters, and we'll go to the Wired Brain Coffee Company's production cluster. I'll click on the Updates tab, and notice how it gives us an informational message right here that says, managing a cluster with a single image will help you to minimize errors and save time by enabling you to maintain all hosts in a cluster with one image. You can click Learn More if you'd like here, but in our case, I'm just going to close this out and click the button that says Manage with a single image. So instead of using a baseline, we're going to use a single image. That brings us to the image section, and I'll click Set up an image. Again, all hosts in the cluster have to be running a minimum of ESXi version 7.0 or greater. This will check our cluster readiness. And you should know that once you convert a cluster to being managed with an image, you can't go back to using baselines on that cluster. What we'll want to do here is to select the version of ESXi that we want to use on this cluster. And notice how these are listed with the most recent version of ESXi on the top. It gives us the release date. We can select any optional vendor add-ons that we'd like to install on this cluster. In our case, we don't need any of the vendor add-ons. We can also select any firmware and driver add-ons that we'd like to apply. This list would be populated when vSphere recognizes specific vendor hardware, for example, HPE, Dell, or Lenovo running in our cluster, and it would tell us the hardware support manager here, and then specific firmware or driver add-ons. And then finally, We can select additional components if we wanted to do that for specific use cases. I'll click Save. Now what we're doing is checking image compliance to make sure that this image is going to work with all the hosts in the cluster. And after a few moments, it tells us that 3 out of 3 hosts are out of compliance with the cluster's image. Each of these hosts will need to be rebooted after the image is installed. And that's what we'll cover in the next lesson. With our cluster image configured, it's now time for some excitement. We're going to remediate our cluster and get it up and running with the latest and greatest ESXi version. Here in the vSphere web client, what I recommend you do first is to run the pre-check to make sure that there are absolutely no issues with performing this remediation. You don't want to incur any downtime on the cluster and specifically business critical applications due to these upgrades that you're going to perform via remediation. Let's give this a moment to complete and we'll analyze the results. The results are in and it says that no pre-check issues were found. All 3 hosts passed their pre-check health analysis. And so this remediation in theory should go just perfectly. We'll be remediating all 3 hosts by simply clicking the Remediate All button. Now, to protect us from bringing down production workloads via this remediation, you can review the remediation impact summary right here. It tells us that 3 hosts are non-compliant, 3 hosts will be remediated, and during that process, since they don't support Quick Boot, all 3 hosts will be rebooted. It says that the hosts will be remediated one at a time, so all 3 of these hosts won't be restarted at once. Everything looks good here. There shouldn't be any downtime for the WiredBrain Coffee Company's applications that are running on this cluster. We'll go ahead and click Start Remediation, and let's give this a few moments to complete. At this point, as you can see, we've got 2 hosts completed and 1 host remaining to remediate. And as you can see, we've had great success here using vSphere Lifecycle Manager. You can see that remediation was completed successfully, and vSphere Lifecycle Manager will continue to pull down ESXi images, firmware, driver, and vendor add-ons that are available for the hosts in this cluster and ensure that they remain up to date. We talked earlier about vSphere Lifecycle Manager depots and the official online depot that by default VLCM will download updates from. And that's absolutely recommended and very convenient. But you should know that you do have other options. So let's now talk about the variety of different download sources that are available to you and how to configure them. We'll start off with, of course, the official online VMware Depot. There's nothing you need to do to configure automatic downloads from the official VMware Online Depot, but you do have some configuration tweaks you can make around this. Let's go over to the vSphere web client and I'll show you exactly how. Earlier, we saw the Lifecycle Manager image depot and how it breaks down into ESXi versions, vendor add-ons, and components. All these are automatically synchronized with VMware.com and automatically downloaded. You can see even the third-party vendor add-ons from the likes of Dell EMC, HPE, Lenovo, NEC, and others are all automatically downloaded as well. So in theory here, you shouldn't have to go and configure a variety of download sources and pull add-ons from different vendor websites. And that's part of the tremendous convenience of the new vSphere Lifecycle Manager. However, if you want to make some configuration changes or tweaks around this, if you go here into settings, you can see the automatic download settings that are available here for patch downloads. If you go into edit, you can see that by default, patches will be automatically downloaded, and the synchronization or download of these patches will happen by default every day. and it will start at a specific date and time. This is actually most likely when my vCenter server was installed, and it's been happening every day since then. You can, of course, tweak this and configure it to download, let's say, every hour on the hour if you wanted to do that. Or, for example, maybe every 8 hours, which would equate to roughly 3 times a day. You can also configure email addresses here so that you'll be automatically alerted whenever new patches are available for the vSphere infrastructure, which could be very convenient. If you go into patch setup, you can see the exact URLs that vSphere Lifecycle Manager is using to download these updates for the vSphere infrastructure. You can select any one of these. You could disable them individually if you chose to do that for some reason, or you could add new download sources. In fact, let's talk about that now. If for whatever reason, the official VMware depot that contains third-party add-ons and components is not enough for you, if you need another source for whatever reason, you could go to another third-party online depot. That is configurable here in the vSphere web client. And again, back here in vSphere Lifecycle Manager, in Settings, Patch Setup, we can click New here. We could specify a new source here. Maybe this is cisco.com for whatever reason, and there's some specific patch URL that you would provide here from the Cisco website. That is possible, and you could enter a description here for it. Click Save. And of course, it tells us it's invalid. It can't be reached right now. That's because I simply made it up. But the point being here that you can add third-party download sources from other online depots if you need to do that. And then your vCenter server, specifically vSphere Lifecycle Manager, will still automatically check those other third-party sources with the same schedule that it's already using to check the official VMware Online Depot. And then you have the first of our offline sources. You can import ISO images, or you can import an offline zip bundle from VMware.com or another source. Here in the vSphere client, you can go to Imported ISOs, and here you can import an ISO that you might have downloaded from VMware.com. That is a possibility, but of course, if you're using the online depots, this really isn't something that you should have to do. Still, it's important to know that this is an option for you. You can also import an offline bundle, which if you go to VMware.com, you would typically download the ISO image, which I showed you how you can download and import into vSphere Lifecycle Manager. But the other option here is to download what they call the offline bundle. This contains VIBs, which are vSphere installation bundles, essentially ESXi plus other installation packages like VMware tools. This can be downloaded in a single zip file, which I've already done. And if we go back here to vSphere Lifecycle Manager and up to Actions, it's here that you can import updates. So if I select Import Updates, notice that I can select Browse. And then here's the VMware ESXi offline depot that I've downloaded from VMware.com. And then we can go ahead and import this as a new update to vSphere Lifecycle Manager. And with that, it was added to the repository. Now, you might be asking yourself, why would someone want to import ISO images or offline bundles into vSphere Lifecycle Manager if you have this automatic synchronization and download from the official VMware Online Depot already? And the answer is typically there are highly secure environments where you don't want this constant downloading and connection to the internet. And because of that, in those secure environments, they may need to disable the online synchronization to the VMware official depot and then simply download any updates and import those manually. So it's always good to have that option should you need it. And then finally, the last download source that you need to be aware of, it's another offline option, and it's called the VMware Update Manager Download Service, also known as UMDS. So again, like our other offline option, let's say that you don't have your vSphere infrastructure connected to the internet for some very highly secure reason. you can use this service called the Update Manager Download Service, which is actually a single shared repository that can be used as an alternative to the official VMware Online Depot. So if you choose to use Update Manager Download Service, this would be a shared repository that you update or populate yourself, and then you point your vSphere Lifecycle Manager server to it to download all of its patches. UMDS is only available for download and installation on Linux operating systems. It no longer runs on Windows with vSphere 7 and later. To be clear, the machine running the Update Manager download service would need internet access, and then once it downloads its patches and updates, it could be disconnected from the internet. You would then go into vSphere Lifecycle Manager, into the settings, into patch setup under administration, and then it's here that you would change the download source. And instead of downloading patches directly from the internet, you would download those patches from a UDMS shared repository, which would be this local machine on your network that your vCenter server could directly access. Again, this isn't something that's recommended, but it's important to know that you have these options available to you should you need them. And then final tip here, you can choose to synchronize updates anytime you'd like. If you go to the image depot, you can see right now our last synchronization was 3 hours ago, and the next synchronization is in 20 hours. However, we just told vCenter to synchronize updates. It's doing so right now. So those are your 4 different download sources available with the vSphere Lifecycle Manager, the official online depot, third-party depots should you need them, and then finally offline depots made up of ISOs or zip offline bundles that you download, or should you choose to use the Update Manager download service so that you make sure you get the latest updates from VMware's official online depot. When it comes to remediation or updating your ESXi hosts that are part of a vSAN cluster, you should know that this is, of course, possible because this is actually what you just saw in this module. Here at the Wired Brain Coffee Company, we have our 3-host vSAN cluster. Those hosts were out of date. We updated ESXi and the virtual machines running on those hosts that are also stored on the vSAN cluster that those hosts are a part of remained up and running 100% of the time. Now, there are some cool new features in vSphere 7 that you should be aware of, specifically related to Lifecycle Manager as it pertains to VMware vSAN. The first one being that you could now use images instead of baselines to keep your vSAN clusters up to date and have all the hosts in the cluster based on a single image. The second new feature is that fault domains are respected. Now, we don't need to go too deeply here into the definition of exactly what a fault domain is. By default, with 3 hosts in a vSAN cluster, each host is going to be its own fault domain. But let's say that you had a vSAN cluster made up of 9 hosts, and you had 3 hosts in each of 3 different racks. Each rack could be considered a fault domain. So when Lifecycle Manager remediated the hosts in the fault domain, it would update the fault domains one at a time to ensure that all hosts in a fault domain are updated at one time. And you can even define the order of the fault domains if you choose. In the past, hosts were updated in a cluster sequentially without any respect to fault domains. Also new in vSphere 7 is reduced host reboot time during remediation to get the host back up and running as quickly as possible. And then, as we've talked about, firmware updates are now supported. So let's go over to the vSphere web client. You can see here on the vSAN cluster, on the Updates tab, all hosts in this cluster are being managed with an image, and all hosts are compliant. If we go into hardware compatibility, here we can run hardware compatibility checks. And what this does is to check the compatibility of the vSAN storage controllers with VMware's official compatibility list. Now, not all hardware on the cluster is checked, as you can see from this warning message, just the vSAN storage controllers. And in this case, here at the Wired Brain Coffee Company, we should be aware that we do have a single controller that's present on all three of the hosts in the cluster that is incompatible with ESXi. You can see the specific hosts and information about the device. This is something that we should point out to the administrator at the Wired Brain Coffee Company, while vSAN seems to be running just fine. And we do have other controllers in the cluster that are compatible, like this NVMe SSD controller. We should be aware of any controllers that are not compatible as well. One other important remediation step that you need to be aware of is after you've upgraded your vSphere infrastructure, you're going to need to come back as well and upgrade your disk compatibility. Here in the vSphere client, we've already performed our remediation. And if you go into your vSAN cluster and into configuration, underneath vSAN disk management, I can see that my disk versions are currently running on version 11. And it gives me a warning here that this is something I need to upgrade. And I'm sure you'll see this in other places in the vSphere client. For example, if I go into Monitor and then down into Skyline Health, it tells us here that we have a disk format version issue that we need to resolve. It's easy to upgrade your disk compatibility. I'll go into Configure, I'll go into vSAN Disk Management, and it's already prompting us to perform the upgrade. Now, to be safe, let's perform the pre-check upgrade first. And it says that the pre-check upgrade completed successfully. It didn't find any issues. We'll go ahead and click Upgrade. And we're told that upgrading the vSAN on-disk format is a long-running operation. Once you upgrade the on-disk format, you cannot roll back software on the host or add certain other older hosts to the cluster. Now, you have the option to allow reduced redundancy, which means that you agree that vSAN will be able to reduce the protection level of your virtual machines in order to speed up the process. Now, I wouldn't consider doing this in a production environment, but to speed up the process in this training course, we're going to allow that reduced redundancy and click Upgrade. We'll monitor the status of the disk format conversion. And after a few moments, you can see that the disk conversion has completed, and now all 6 disks are running the latest version 13. So that's how you upgrade your disk compatibility as part of your vSphere upgrade process. Another cool feature of vSphere Lifecycle Manager is the ability to keep your VMware tools running in your virtual machines up to date. Here in the vSphere web client, there are multiple places that you can go to check the status of VMware tools. You can select an individual virtual machine. Of course, this virtual machine doesn't even have VMware tools installed. That's something we need to do. But perhaps another virtual machine. Yes, this virtual machine has VMware tools, but it's not running, and it also needs to be upgraded or updated. If you go to the cluster level and go to Updates, and then select VMware Tools, you can see the status of VMware Tools on all the virtual machines running in the cluster. But first, you need to check status. Let's go ahead and do that now. And it tells us that 1 out of the 8 virtual machines in the cluster are up to date. You can see that none of the virtual machines have auto update configured for their VMware Tools. That would be something that we could select for all virtual machines and set to auto update on. And then to get all the virtual machines updated, we can click here to upgrade to match host. And this tells us, actually warns us, that upgrading a virtual machine might require that it's powered on, powered off, or rebooted multiple times. Only 5 virtual machines can be updated per host at one time. In this case, it says that 6 virtual machines will be upgraded. You can see the list of virtual machines. You can choose to schedule this if you would like. There are scheduling options here if you wanted to do this later in the evening, perhaps in the middle of the night. There are also rollback options enabled by default so that a virtual machine will be snapshotted before the new VMware tools are installed. By default, the snapshots will not be deleted, but let's say that we wanted to delete those after 1 hour. We'll call the snapshots before VMware tools install, update, and click upgrade to match host. Now you can see that a remediation is happening. This will take place once for each of the virtual machines in the cluster. Let's give this a few moments to complete and I'll show you the results. At this point, we installed VMware Tools on one virtual machine and upgraded it on another virtual machine. If we check status again, we can see now that 2 of the 8 virtual machines are up to date, which might not sound like a very good number. However, I can tell you that not all of these virtual machines have operating systems installed. In fact, all of these that have a status of unknown, that status is unknown because they don't have an operating system. And of course, you can install VMware Tools without an operating system. But we were able to update the virtual machine that needed an update and then configure all of these virtual machines to auto update, such that when these virtual machines do have an operating system installed, the VMware Tools will be automatically updated. Now, another place to go to see the status of VMware Tools across your entire vSphere infrastructure is here in the virtual machine and templates inventory. And then if you click on even up at the vCenter server level, you can go into updates and then into VMware Tools and see the VMware Tools status across all virtual machines in all clusters. For example, this is the Prod 1 cluster that we just looked at, but here's another cluster, the Management 1 cluster. And let's go ahead and check status in the Management 1 cluster. You can see that we have guest managed virtual machine tools for the vCenter server appliance. And then both of these virtual machines have their VMware Tools already up to date. Let's go ahead and select these and set their auto update status to on, such that their VMware Tools will be kept automatically updated from here on out. So that's how easy it is to use vSphere Lifecycle Manager to keep your VMware Tools up to date. Let's now move on and talk about updating virtual machine hardware. vSphere Lifecycle Manager also makes keeping your virtual machine hardware up to date easy. Here in the vSphere client, if we go to the virtual machines and templates inventory, and then to updates and over to VM hardware for virtual machine hardware, you can see here that we can select any of the clusters that we have in our vSphere infrastructure, and then we can click check status to check the status of the virtual machine hardware running on the virtual machines in that cluster. And then what we can do is we can sort here by the status of the virtual machines. And in our case, we have a couple of virtual machines that need their virtual machine hardware up to date. They need an upgrade. We have one virtual machine whose hardware is up to date. And then we have a number of virtual machines whose hardware is unknown. In our case, let's go ahead and upgrade this virtual machine that needs an upgrade to the latest virtual machine hardware to match that of the host. It tells us that this virtual machine may be powered on, powered off, or rebooted multiple times. You can see the virtual machine is selected here. Notice that just like with VMware Tools, you can schedule this to happen at a later date. You can also utilize rollback options. For example, to take a snapshot of the virtual machine, with the default being to not delete it. In my case, I'll choose to keep it for 1 hour and click upgrade to match the host. Let's go ahead and give this a moment to complete. And after a few moments, if we check the status again and sort here by status, you can see that our Active Directory domain controller is now up to date. We used vSphere Lifecycle Manager to scan the virtual machines, identify which of those need virtual machine hardware updates, and then remediate, effectively updating the virtual machine hardware, which, keep in mind, will require a virtual machine reboot.